Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last session of Peralta Online Equity Conference Day 1. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for not feeling tired or overwhelmed. I know we have wonderful sessions. If you have missed some of them, don't worry, because we're going to be recording all the sessions and posting it in our YouTube channel and also on our website. So I would like to welcome Caleb Hutchins for this session called Raising an Eyebrow at Grades, a very brief introduction to ungrading. Welcome, Caleb. And before we start, I would like to also go over a few housekeeping items. Please note that this session is being recorded and we are using automated Zoom captions during the session. We will edit the recording transcripts before we share them with you all. At the bottom of Zoom window, there's a closed caption button, and you will see the live transcript text underneath that button. Select to turn them on or off as you prefer. And please pose your questions using the chat function that I'll moderate and discuss with our presenter. Toward the end of the hour, we'll share how we can continue the conversation online and share some additional resources to support your teaching. And I'll also share a Padlet link for you to ask questions or make comments about this session. Now, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Caleb Hutchins. Welcome, Caleb.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you see my presentation slide here?
Yes.
Okay, great. Give me just a moment here because I wanted to make sure that I can still see all the attendees. Let's see if it'll show me that. Oh, maybe I don't have my meetings set up that way. That's all right. Okay, so thank you for coming to the one of the two last sessions of the day. I know it's been a long day for some of you, so I appreciate you being here. I'm going to try to make this fairly quick and straightforward and not take up too much mental bandwidth, but it is a complicated subject. So we're going to do our best to get through it. My name is Caleb Hutchins. My pronouns are he, him. My primary job is instructional designer for the community colleges of Spokane in Spokane, Washington. In addition to being an instructional designer, I'm also fortunate enough to get to adjunct teach usually at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. I'm able to adjunct for the graduate program that I originally graduated from. I get to adjunct teach the learning technologies class, which is a ton of fun. So let's jump right into this session here. Okay, here are our session objectives. The first thing I want to do is discuss how grading policies might impact student equity, inclusion, and success. And then we're going to explore kind of a working definition of what ungrading means as a teaching practice. Then I'm going to spend a little bit of time identifying some tools and techniques in your learning management system that can support ungrading. In my case, I mostly work with Canvas, so that's where my examples will come from. But hopefully, most or all of the tools and techniques are applicable to other LMSs, whether you use Blackboard or Moodle or D2L or something else. Hopefully these will still be helpful to you. And then lastly, I'm going to provide an annotated bibliography with some additional resources about ungrading. Some readings, some articles, some research, some narratives that hopefully will be helpful if you are interested in diving more deeply into this subject. Because as my title said, this is going to be a very brief introduction to the topic of ungrading, which is kind of a large, broad, ever-expanding topic. So we are really going to give a fairly surface level overview of the idea. And then if you are intrigued, you can do further research, and hopefully my bibliography will help with that. In addition to my learning objectives, I also want to provide a summary for session jumpers, because like personally, I am a session jumper. I have to admit that if I hop into a session and I'm not quite feeling it, or if I feel like I kind of get where they're going and I'm not quite as engaged as I was hoping to be, Sometimes I'll hop off to another one. So I understand that. It's not going to hurt my feelings if you do that. But I did want to give you a quick summary if you are a session jumper like me, and this will either whet your appetite for more or tell you that you're not as into this as you thought you were going to be. First summary point, traditional grading frameworks are inaccurate, and we'll get into this more in more detail. Second point, traditional grading frameworks are inequitable. We will again expand on that. Multiple alternatives to traditional grading frameworks do exist, and ungrading is kind of a trendy umbrella term that covers a number of these alternatives. So we will unpack that more, but that's just my little session jumper summary for people that are kind of on the fence on whether they want to give me 45 minutes of their life. First, I have a chat question for everyone. What is your primary role at your institution? And please respond in the chat. That would be super helpful. Faculty member, English faculty, great. Faculty support, ESOL, faculty and DE coordinator, exercise science, associate director of teaching and learning, excellent, faculty support, awesome, faculty training and development, this is wonderful. Nice to have kind of some diversity of backgrounds and roles here, so that's wonderful. Thank you for answering that. And then I have a second question for you. Question 2, how familiar are you personally with the concept of ungrading? And I have some example answers you might give. I know almost nothing about it, or I think I know a little bit, but I have questions. Maybe you know quite a bit about ungrading, but only in theory, or maybe you have real world experience with practicing ungrading. So again, this will kind of help me know where people are at. New to me, I know nothing. That's like a platonic philosophical answer, right? All I know is I know nothing. That's cool. I've heard of the term a few times over the years, but I'm embarrassed I never really paid that much attention to what it means. That's an excellent answer. Quite a bit in theory, no direct experience. Between theory and experience, ooh, so practicing, I love it. You're practicing ungrading. I dig it. I know a little bit, know some in theory. Okay, wonderful. Is it similar to contract grading? You'll find out shortly. Okay. Before we get into ungrading, I first wanted to spend some time kind of unpacking why we might want to look at alternative grading strategies in the first place. There are, frankly, many issues with the traditional grading system. When I say traditional grading, I mean A through F letter grades, I mean 100-point percentage grades, I mean 4.0 to 0.0 GPA grading schemes. Those are what we call, what most of us think of as traditional grading schemes. And honestly, those grading practices they're not like some eternal law of nature, right? They were they started being developed in the late 1800s and didn't really become standardized until maybe 1930, 1920. And they were tools developed to help deal with assessment and credentialing in sort of like industrial education. Once we started building things like public schools and public universities, and we are sort of standardizing and turning education into sort of a factory model, that's where these practices came from. Sorry, I'll get off that soapbox and get on another one for a second. So here are some, but not all, issues with traditional grading. I just want to pick out 3 or 4 that like personally resonate with me, like things that when I learned about them, I personally felt like, oh, that makes a lot of sense and that really bothers me. So the first one is reliability. The second one is human bias. The third one is student behavior. And the fourth one is equity and student success. So the first one, reliability. there is this concept that comes out of research. A lot of it comes from like medical and pharmaceutical fields, which I'm not an expert on that at all. But there's this idea of reliability. There's inter-rater reliability, which means the degree of agreement between independent observers who are assessing the same artifact. If you ask 2 or 3 different instructors to assess the same student product, inter-rater reliability means how closely do those 3 instructors' assessments align with each other. And then the second one is intra-rater reliability, the consistency in ratings given by the same person across multiple instances of assessment. And the best explanation for that made the most sense to me as a non-research expert is something that Richard Haswell came up with. Richard was, I think he's retired now, but he was the director of a developmental writing center for Washington State University. He did a lot of research and a lot of writing on the topic of developmental English teaching and learning. And he kind of put it this way. He said, let's say you have 100 buckets all in a row, and those buckets are labeled 0 to 100. And then you put a person in front of those buckets and you give them a piece of student writing. And you say, I want you to take this paper and I want you to put it in the bucket that you think it deserves to be in based on quality on a rating scale of 0 to 100. 100 buckets, put it in one of those buckets. Let's say you put it in number 72. So, okay, great. This paper gets a 72%. Now, let's say you bring the same person back to the same buckets 3 days later, and you give them the exact same piece of student work, and you ask them to do it again. How likely do you think it is that they will pick the exact same bucket out of 100 buckets that they picked the previous time? And that's even with the exact same work, let alone a different student's work. I mean, I think that unlikely, yeah. I think it is unlikely because we're constantly being influenced by outside elements, whether you got enough sleep the last night or not, what you ate for lunch, or maybe you didn't eat and you're feeling kind of hangry. Maybe you looked at a student work before this one and either it was really good, which biases you against this one, or it was really bad, which makes this one look better. All those things make intra-rater reliability not very reliable, honestly. And Richard made the case that there's a lot of good statistical research that shows that this is the case. So in Richard's case, he advocated for fewer buckets. If you had a scale of 1 to 5, then it's much more likely that you will have intra-rater reliability when you're using a grading mechanism that has fewer options. And this is a grading rubric, right? If you have a rubric that goes from 1 to 5, then that's what you choose the score for that student product. Ultimately, for Richard, in developmental writing, he came to advocate for a 2-bucket approach, complete or incomplete, met or not met. And some people call this specifications grading, right? You describe the specifications for a assignment or a project, and then the students either meet those specifications or they don't. Richard Haswell advocated for a 2-bucket rating approach, which in his mind, and again, he had research to back this up, makes it more reliable and less variable based on outside influences. So that's the first point I wanted to make, was reliability. The second one, human bias. And as a straight cisgendered white man from the Pacific Northwest, I'm not really the person qualified to talk about this. So I mean, human bias, well, it's all around us. There's so many examples in the news and in society and in research and education. Human bias exists. But I did want to find like one example. So I was thinking to myself, well, specifically in like education, how far back can we go in the educational process and still find bias? And the answer is basically all the way back to preschool. So there was this research, this experiment done in 2016 that the researchers did using conference attendees for a conference of early educators, preschool teachers and preschool administrators. Participants were recruited at this conference and asked to identify disruptive or challenging behavior while watching videos of a sex and race balanced group of preschoolers engaging in typical activities. In other words, there was an equal number of male and female kids and an equal number of white and non-white kids. And then participants' eye gazes were tracked as they were watching those videos. So they could measure what the participants were looking at in those videos. Another key part of this experiment was there were no disruptive behaviors actually shown in the recordings. All of the kids in all of the video recordings were behaving perfectly normally. There was no disruptive behavior. Anyone want to take a guess as to what the results of this experiment were? No, that's okay. The answer, the results were participants spent more time scrutinizing Black boys, and when asked which children required most of their attention, most participants identified Black boys in the recordings as most needing intervention and correction. So again, 2 points to make here. These were professional early educators. These weren't random people off the streets. These were professional preschool teachers. And there were no disruptive behaviors actually shown in the recordings. Nonetheless, most of the participants spent most of their time honing in on the Black male students because they had bias. They thought these kids are more likely to get into trouble, more likely to cause problems. So that's all the way back in preschool. We already have these biases creeping into our educational system. And I don't need to tell everyone here that this just continues on into public school and high school and college. Human bias is part of our system, unfortunately, and educators are biased, whether they like to admit it or not. Okay, so that's human bias. Third point, student behavior. A researcher named Alfie Kohn, you may have heard of him. He wrote this really great research article. Actually, I think eventually it was turned into a book, but it started as an article, The Case Against Grades. And in that, he does a meta-analysis of research on grading practices going way back to the 40s and 30s, 50s, 60s, and on up to present day. And he said that the research consistently came up with 3 determinations when it comes to grades. First, grades tend to diminish student interest in learning. When you make the motivation focused on earning the best possible grade, it diminishes your intrinsic motivation. Second, grades tend to create a preference for the easiest possible task. So again, if the students are focused on earning the best possible grade, they're less likely to take risks, less likely to make creative decisions when they are approaching a task. They are going to find the lowest common denominator. They're going to play it safe because they don't want to risk failing. They don't want to risk earning a poor grade because they took a chance on something. And then third, he found grades tend to reduce the quality of student thinking. And again, he cites research and experiments where if you have a group of students memorize some facts, I think the one he showed was memorizing some historical dates. If you tell a group of students that they are being graded on their memorization of those dates, it actually lowered their ability to remember those dates days later compared to a control group where they were not told that they would be graded on it. They were simply asked to remember these dates. So, Alfie Kohn makes a very convincing argument in my mind that grades have detrimental impacts on student learning, student creativity, and student motivation. And then the last one for my the problems I have with traditional grading is institutional equity and student success. And this comes from an educator and writer, Jesse Stommel. You may have heard of him if you are at all familiar with grading, because he's kind of a popular pop education writer right now, and he talks a lot about ungrading. But in a recent article, I think from February of this year, he said, if an institution continued grading as usual during the pandemic over the last 2 years, here's what all those grades have been measuring. How well students and teachers pivoted to working online. If students had necessary access to course materials and meetings. If students had sufficient support systems in their life. If students had safe homes from which to shelter in place. How capable the student was of performing in a crisis. What all these grades mostly weren't measuring, Jesse posits, they were not necessarily measuring student learning, student engagement, or student content knowledge. They were measuring all these institutional gaps and equity gaps that the students were facing. If a student doesn't have good internet access, that impacts their grades. The student is couch surfing because they don't have a safe home environment, that's going to impact their grades. So Jesse's point is, what are we really grading? Are we actually grading student understanding and knowledge and growth? Or are we grading all these outside influences that are constantly bombarding college students? Okay, so those are just some things that personally resonated with me, problems that I see with traditional grading. So then the question becomes, well, what are there alternatives? Are there better ways to do this? Are there more equitable or just ways to assess student content or understanding or knowledge or performance? So that brings us to this idea of ungrading. And like I said in my little session jumper summary, ungrading is kind of this umbrella term for lots of different practices. And like somebody in the chat said, is it similar to contract grading? Yes, contract grading is something that would fall inside of this umbrella of ungrading. Another thing that might fall in there is specifications grading. Going back to Richard Haswell's two-bucket approach, you give specifications and either the student met it or they didn't meet it. So ungrading is kind of this nebulous term, which is part of, I think, the confusion surrounding this hyped up marketing term, for lack of a better word. It kind of is. It's this hyped up term used to generate interest and curiosity, which is fine. In this case, I'm fine with that. So I wanted to find some example definitions that different people and different organizations have come up with and see if I can find some consistent themes and how people are defining ungrading. But before we do that, theoretical framework alert. This is where I have to remind myself that basically all theoretical frameworks that we try to design are just the human nervous system's attempt to impose order on a chaotic universe. Basically, everything and experience in our world is on a very complicated and fuzzy spectrum. So I try to be skeptical of frameworks, just as a general rule. I think that frameworks can be helpful when we are first approaching a topic to kind of create categories and themes in our brain, but they are often what you call lies to children. They are simplifications of complex phenomenon. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. Anyway, looking for definitions of ungrading. So Capilano University Center for Teaching Engagement, I think is what CTE stands for. Their definition is the practice of minimizing or eliminating grades in order to focus on meaningful feedback and student learning. Okay, I like that pretty good. Lafayette, Siddles, and again, I don't really quite know, I can't remember what that stands for because all of our teaching and learning centers have different acronyms. But they define it as an umbrella term for any assessment that decenters the action of an instructor assigning a summary grade to student work. Jesse Stommel, who we mentioned earlier, His definition, I actually stole part of it for my session title, is raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice distinct from simply not grading. It's an ongoing process, not a static set of practices. As somebody said in the chat, it's practice, or it's praxis. It's theory, it's practice, it's reflection, it's an ongoing process. Missouri State University defines ungrading as a classroom philosophy that emphasizes feedback rather than scores or letter grades. And then I had one more definition that I don't love as much. This one comes from Pearson, our good friends at the Pearson Textbook Corporation. And they said, what is ungrading? Many instructors are now exploring the ungrading model as a potential solution. Because we still need grades at the end of each semester, there's still a need to view and evaluate student work. It's how we evaluate the work that will be different in this model. In the different models of ungrading, instructors don't grade every piece of work and award points. They decide whether the piece of work meets their standard or not. If not, the work is sent back to students for revisions. I don't like this definition because it's making a lot of assumptions here. Because we still need grades at the end of each semester. Well, that's what our institutions often ask us, but is that a fundamental law of nature, or is that just a practice that we currently follow? They decide what instructors don't grade every piece of work or award points. Well, that's one kind of ungrading, but again, this is a broad term that encompasses a lot of things. Decide whether a piece of work meets their standard or not. Again, that's one way of doing it. If not, the work is sent back to students for revisions. Again, that is one way of doing it, but that's not all that ungrading is. So based on some of those definitions that I found doing some research and some searching and some reading, I kind of started to pick out some themes that I saw repeated over and over again in these different definitions. First, I think ungrading is a verb, not a noun. Again, it's an active, reflective process. It's not just one thing. It is the process of critically examining your grading policies. It's examining and deconstructing the purpose of grading. Why are we doing it in the first place? Again, it's an umbrella term for a spectrum of techniques and policies. It's not just one set in stone framework. It's encompassing many different philosophies and strategies and practices. A big part of it is simply decentering grading, assessment, and quantification as the goal, right? I don't think that assessment is the goal. Assessment is a tool to measure student learning and growth, which is the real goal, right? It centers feedback, process, revision, and improvement. Because again, it's not one single product at one single point in time. It's growth. It's movement over time. It emphasizes transparency, intrinsic motivation, as opposed to extrinsic motivation, and student agency, student choice, student control. What ungrading does not mean, it does not mean abolishing all grades or grading practices. Again, this is where I think that Pearson definition kind of falls flat. It doesn't mean we never score or never grade anything. It does mean we are critically examining how and why and what we are grading. It also does not mean reducing rigor or passing all students. I think that often people, when they have kind of a surface level understanding of what ungrading means, that's what they think in their mind, right? It means you dumb the material down so that everybody passes, everybody gets an A, a gold star, and they move on, regardless of whether they learned anything or performed something that you wanted them to perform or not. I don't believe that's what ungrading means. So based on those themes, those ideas, this is kind of the definition that I came up with that makes sense to me. And again, theoretical framework alert, this is not a physical law of nature. This is just kind of a framework that helps me understand this concept. So this is what I came up with. Ungrading, any reflective teaching practice that actively interrogates and deconstructs traditional grading as a necessary or desirable component of assessment, with a goal of increasing student agency, self-reflection, critical thinking, and intrinsic motivation for growth. So that's kind of what I came up with. Again, not an expert. This is just kind of my best understanding of what ungrading means right now. I'm going to pause for a second because I've been talking a lot. I'm going to take a drink and breathe. If anybody has any questions, comments, if you are skeptical or critical of this concept, I am very happy to hear that. Whether you want to unmute yourself or whether you want to type in the chat, I'm all for it.
I'm also sharing the Padlet link in the chat box.
Great, great.
Also share your comments and feedback in that Padlet board as well.
Excellent. I haven't looked at that since before our session started, so I don't know if there's anything there yet. Okay, it's okay if nobody wants to jump up right now, because I think that it is helpful to see some specific examples of what this might mean in practice. That kind of helps solidify these ideas, and then maybe you might start to see how it could interface with your own teaching practice. So because my main job is an instructional designer, a big part of my job is working with our learning management system, helping instructors work with it, use the tools productively, design their courses effectively and accessibly. So I wanted to share some specific examples from our LMS. And again, this is Canvas specific, but basically every LMS should have similar or identical tools. And I would say if you want to try any of these and you're not sure how to do it in your system, consult your friendly neighborhood instructional designer, and hopefully they would be happy to help you. Let's do this question real quick, because I guess I shouldn't be making those assumptions. Do we want to move on to Canvas and LMS examples of ungrading in practice, or does anybody have anything on their mind right now? Wants to see Canvas examples. Okay, excellent. Examples, great. Let's see some examples. Okay. So first one, and probably the simplest possible form of dipping your toe into ungrading, and probably something that some of you already do, dropping the lowest grade in an assignment category. And again, these are screenshots from Canvas. Other systems will do this a little bit differently, but pretty much all of them do this. Let's say, for example, you have weekly reflection papers that you ask your students to submit. You can set your learning management system, your course, to drop the lowest score or the lowest 2 scores. In my mind, this does a couple things. One, hopefully, and this might require some explicit mention on your part, hopefully this gives students a little bit more boldness in what they're writing, a little bit more of a chance to take risks, show some creativity, try something out of the ordinary. Because again, like Alfie Kohn found, focusing too much on grades tends to cause students to pick the simplest possible task. But if we are saying, well, if you try something creative or different or weird and it falls flat, it's not the end of the world because we're dropping the 2 lowest grades in this category. The other thing this does is, yes, you will probably just have students that skip an assignment and just don't turn anything in, knowing that their lowest grade is going to be dropped. At first, you might think, well, that's a problem. I don't like that. But going back to Jesse Stommel's thoughts about how sometimes grading is what we're really assessing is all these external influences and institutional gaps that are affecting students' lives. Maybe a student just can't get it done this week. Maybe their kids got sick. Maybe their job schedule changed. Maybe they're taking care of parents. maybe their housing situation suddenly became tenuous. All these things might be very valid reasons to say, I just can't do it this week. And as instructors, we can either tell them, tough luck, that's a huge drop in your overall grade, and probably going to drop you a letter grade, and maybe if you're right on the edge, might lead you into failure. Or we can say, well, sometimes things happen in life, and here's an out. We're dropping the lowest grade in this category. Try it. Hopefully you'll be able to do better next week, but let me know if you can. So dropping the lowest grade, super simple, straightforward ungrading practice you could do in your LMS. Complete incomplete assignments. When you are designing an assignment in your LMS, and again, the specific settings will vary from one system to another, you don't have to set it up as a letter grade or as a percentage grade. You can just set it up as a complete or incomplete, met or not met. You did it or you didn't. And in some cases, that might be appropriate. This kind of comes back to another grading practice, and I think it was mentioned here, contract grading. This idea of, especially in like developmental classes, developmental English, developmental math, what we really want is time spent engaging with the material. And we know for a fact that if you spend enough time reading and writing, you will improve, you will demonstrate growth, and you will get better at it. And maybe we don't care as much about picking apart the specific mechanics of every paper you write. What we care about is you're writing every day. So in that case, you might just do a complete or incomplete. I just want you to do something. In the chat I see, but complete, incomplete is still attached to a number, right? That is often true, not necessarily, but in Canvas at least, yes, it is still attached. You are still giving a score to that assignment. In this case, it's just set for 10 points. So as far as the grade book in Canvas is concerned, either the student earns 10 points or they earn 0 points. It's complete or it's incomplete. And this is something that you would probably pair with other policies. You would have to be explicit in your late work policies of, if you miss a deadline, what happens then? Do I just want you to move on and forget it? Or do I want you to get it done and bring it to me, even if it takes a little bit longer? So part of this process is being explicit about how you're setting these things up and why. Susan says Canvas can do complete and incomplete with no points. You can, yes. But if you do that, if you set it up, yeah, then you would have to make it worth 0 points, which means it would not impact the final grade calculation in the class, but it does show a 0, which I don't love. This is where we kind of bump up against the educational industrial complex, where the system really wants to put a point value on everything. So at a certain point, we're kind of stuck with what the system wants us to do, and we kind of have to work around it and stretch it a little bit. But anyway, let's move forward. That's complete and complete. Reassigning for revision. This is not a new concept, right? If you've been through graduate school or a doctoral program, most of your work was probably a revision and resubmission process, right? You don't turn in your giant thesis project one time and then either you pass or you fail. It's a process of, you make a draft, you submit it to your instructor, they look at it, they give you feedback, they send it back to you for revision. You revise and you submit, you revise and you submit until you come up with a product that you and your instructor are happy with and satisfied with. So this is not a new idea, but I don't often see it at lower levels. In the community college system, we don't see this very often. But again, Canvas makes this fairly easy, and other LMSs can do similar things. When a student submits, okay, 5 minutes to go. Good, we can do this. When a student submits a paper or an assignment, you can look at that, you can give them feedback, and then there's a reassign button that you click on that, and then the student gets a notification by the system saying, oh, your instructor has given you feedback and they would like you to redo this. So reassign for revision. Super straightforward, not a new concept. We've been doing it for decades, but that is a form of ungrading. We're showing growth, revision, process over product. Rubrics. Again, going back to Haswell, fewer buckets. You don't have to use a 0 to 100% scale to score student work. You can have fewer buckets, and that hopefully lessens your bias bleeding into your grading process, lessens external influences like whether you're hangry or tired. If you only have 3 or 4 or 5 options rather than 100, it's probably going to be a more reliable and reproducible grade. Another thing that's nice about rubrics is it has built-in feedback and built-in transparency for what the criteria for the assignment is. But you can also do non-scoring rubrics. You can use a rubric that includes your criteria and your performance levels and all those details that we like about rubrics, but it doesn't have to be connected to a grade. You can combine non-scoring rubrics with complete and incomplete. These two things go together very well. The students get the feedback, the formative feedback that you're giving them through the rubric, but it's not turning it into a percentage. Big fan of non-scoring rubric, awesome. And then I think this is my last one, so we don't run out of time. Automated student self-assessments. This is something that I forget Dr. Matthias's first name, but he wrote about this process that he's developed, which I personally really like. He assigns a paper or a research or reflection or discussion or whatever the assignment is, and it does not have a point value attached to it. It is an ungraded assignment, which again, in Canvas and in most LMSs, you do not have to attach an actual grade item in the grade book to every assignment. So he gives them the paper, they have instructions, they know what they're supposed to do, they go and do it. After they have submitted their work, then they take a self-assessment quiz on their work for that paper. And the self-assessment quiz has true-false questions. Did I submit the paper? Yes or no. Did I follow all the instructions? Yes or no. You can take what would have been a grading rubric and turn each of those criteria and levels into questions on a quiz. And then the student fills that out as honestly as we hope that they will be, and self-reflective, and then that automatically generates a score and goes into the grade book. They are giving themselves a score, they are giving themselves a grade, and it's going into the grade book, but we are putting some of the agency and the control back on the student. Now, Matthias says he's been doing this for, well, I think 5 or 6 years, and he said the vast majority, over 90% of his students do this really well. They are reflective, they are honest, they give themselves a fair grade that is very close to what he would have given them if he was grading it traditionally. He also says, though, on the very rare occasion where a student is maybe trying to game the system and turns in subpar work and gives himself a perfect score, he always reserves the right to intervene, have a conversation with the student and say, hey, you know, let's be honest here. Did you really follow all these instructions? Do you really think this work is worth full credit or full points? And he said that usually just having that conversation, that intervention, prevents it from happening a second time. So what I like about this is it gives the student more agency and control. It's putting more trust in the student. It's automating this process a little bit, which makes the instructor's life easier. You can spend more time just giving written feedback, actionable, formative feedback, and not worrying about the score. You give that to the students, you put a little bit of trust and faith in them. Okay, lastly, before we run out of time, I said that I would give you an annotated bibliography about ungrading, and here it is. I'm going to, let's see if it'll let me do this. I'm going to share the direct link in the chat. We can also put it in the Padlet after the session is over. to everyone. Oh, is it gonna let me do it? Share, link copied. There we go. Okay, so this is a resource that I've been working on for a while now with help from some of my colleagues at Spokane Community Colleges. And we have some, what I think are some pretty good readings on the topic of ungrading. We've got Alfie Cohn, The Case Against Grades, which is a foundational article on this topic, and honestly changed my opinion on what grading can be and should be. We've got Jesse Stommel in here. We've got some research. We've got some history on gradings. We've got Asao Inoue talking about labor-based grading contracts, which is a whole completely huge giant topic on its own that I don't have time for, but there's a kind of an introduction to it. And then I also have some more detailed information about some of those LMS ungrading techniques that I showed you. So this document is a living document. It's in Google Docs, which means if I ever make any changes to it, it all shows up here. So I will continue to build onto this over time. So feel free to keep it, save it, share it. It will continue to grow. And with that, I think I'm out of slides. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. And if we have any time for comments, questions, if I remember correctly in the chat, a couple people had some real world experience doing ungrading. And if we have time and if anybody is willing to share, I would love to hear your experiences with ungrading.
We have a question, Caleb, in the chat box. What do you think of having students offer evidence for what they feel should be their final grade? Have you tried that with your class?
So I have not 100% ungraded the class that I teach yet. I hope to do that. I'm working towards it. That takes some development. Jesse Stommel, in his class, the classes that he teaches, at the start of the course, he tells students, I will not be assigning you a grade. At the end of the course, we will have a conversation and you will tell me what grade you have earned in this class. And he said that this usually creates a lot of anxiety at the start and sometimes even anger from students who say, just give me the dang grade. But usually by the end of the course, through conversation, through reflection, through practicing this philosophy in the course, students really kind of feel freed from the grading framework, and they can honestly reflect on their own growth and their own process over the course. And he said he's had great success allowing students to tell him their final grade at the end of the course. I'm just reading through the chat here. Metacognition, revision, emphasizing process, grading less. I can get on board with all of these things, but there are still grades. I think my biggest problem with ungrading is that it is still grading, and that gets confusing. That's a great point. That is a great point, because the truth is at the end of the class, at the end of the semester or quarter, you have to turn something into the registrar's office. You have to give either a letter or a point value, and it goes on a student's transcript and it follows them forever. So that does still happen in our current system. How you get there, though, is entirely up to you as the instructor. You have control over that. You don't have to simply use a spreadsheet with numbers and sum it all up and turn it into a percentage. You can have a final grade rubric that you follow. You can do contract grading where you are telling students at the start of the class, if you put in X amount of effort, you are going to get X grade at the end of the class. There are different ways to approach this. Again, you can ask the student, what do you think you've earned in this class, and have an honest conversation with them individually. So there are ways that you can deal with that. Yes, something has to be written down at the end of the class. How you get there is up to you. How do you guard against learners with imposter syndromes? So that's a great question, because in my opinion and in my experience, and again, this is just me, traditional grading often exacerbates imposter syndrome. If a student has a bad grading experience, they bomb a test, they thought they did great on a paper and they get a poor grade back. For some students, that is just devastating, right? It ruins them for the whole rest of the class, and sometimes it ruins them for their entire educational experience. One of the articles, one of the narratives in that bibliography, a teacher has this narrative of a ambitious, creative, passionate student who, in his words, was broken on the wheel of my grading policies. They had a bad experience, life events intruded, caused them to fail an assignment, and he lost that student. They gave up, they did not complete the class, and he still regrets that experience to this day. So I guess that would be the argument that I would make, is traditional grading, I think, makes imposter syndrome worse, and giving students more control, more freedom, and more clarity can help alleviate imposter syndrome. A quote I read on Twitter a while ago really stuck with me. It asked the question, do you have imposter syndrome or do you have white supremacy? You know, is it your own sense of inadequacy, or is it the system telling you that you are inadequate? That stuck with me. I've been thinking about that one a lot since I read it.
That's really interesting, Caleb. I've never thought about that imposter syndrome and white supremacy, the relationship between these two.
Well, and you know, there's gender roles that play into that as well. Power dynamics in higher education and in business. Is imposter syndrome something that you're feeling, or have you been told by people in authority that you don't deserve to be here?
Thank you so much, Caleb, and everyone. And earlier today, we had another session, and Natasha is here. Maybe she can also talk about that. That was related to ungrading. And Natasha asked questions at the very beginning of the session. How many of you like grading, or what do you think about grading? And everyone's like, you know, none of us like grading.
Who are we doing it for, right? Most instructors don't like the process. You'd much rather be doing something else. So if we can design a framework that decenters that and gives you a chance for interaction and feedback and reflection, I say let's embrace it.
That will be awesome. And I was thinking like automated student self-assessment you mentioned, and it also like, it's kind of like expressing, how can I say, sharing how we feel about students, how we trust them about automated self-grading. Yeah, we trust you. You are all adults. You can take care of it. Yeah. Probably more in K-12, right? But still in higher education.
When I've talked about this and presented about this topic with faculty in my institution, I usually get that pushback from at least one person of, but what if they do this? Well, I don't know. What if they do? What do you do then? Well, you talk to them, you have a conversation, you intervene, you say, well, let's be honest here. What do we need to do to get you there? I don't think that we should abandon good practices because of but sometimes. There's always going to be a but sometimes. What we really want to ask ourselves is, how can we most equitably serve all of our students, or as many of our students as possible? And we don't want to let the but sometimes prevent us from doing those things.
Thank you, Caleb, and thank you everyone for this engaging discussion. I know this is the last session, but still I see the room is full. Nobody has left, even though we're going 10 minutes over. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Everyone, please use the Padlet for your questions and comments after this session. Tomorrow, we will continue with wonderful presentations. And this time it will be analyzed. The concept will be analyzed. And we're going to start 8 a.m. tomorrow. We will be in the same Zoom room all day. So please join us. Hope to see you tomorrow again. Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.